Vern Rife. Vern Rife was still, but I'm not absolutely certain. I think Vern Rife was still Speaker of the House at the time. The bill passed fairly quickly. It was sponsored by Senator Brandstuhl out of my home county, Licking County, and went through fairly quickly. There were a number of issues raised at that time, and there were strikes occurring, Dave, at that time, right before the 1983, in the decade of the 70s, including a strike in the city of Toledo by the police officers there, numerous school strikes, and the goal was, again, to eliminate the strikes in the public service. The later Justice in the Supreme Court, Andy Douglas, was on City Council in Toledo when the firefighters went on strike in Toledo as well. So we had a lot of history there coming forward. Collective bargaining in Ohio became very robust during the 80s and 90s. Large sectors were put under contract, major changes occurred, and a lot of fact-finding conciliation hearings occurred during that period of time. So that's the brief history in Ohio for those who don't go back as far as I do in the timeline. The number of strikes were reduced to almost zero, less than 10 in any given year, and that data is available from SERB if everyone wants to go back and check that. So now we had a flurry of conciliations and fact findings. As I said, in the 80s and 90s, recession hit, and we had another flurry of them in the time of the recessions in 2008 to 2012. And now we're seeing a rise on them again. And so I think the 2008 to 12 and the current increase in the number of impasse hearings is due to the economic issues, as well as you noted quite aptly about the industry and the service, the hotels and restaurants, the availability of manpower. So it's become a very interesting and challenging process, both at the negotiating table with the budget issues and in the impasse proceedings. And we each have our arguments, and I know a number of the people attending today represent one side or the other on those difficult and challenging issues that we have.
Okay.
Do you want to go into the definitions? I think Shianne could talk a little bit about what some of those definitions there as well.
Jonathan, can I add one thing? The public sector jobs have recovered about 58% nationally, whereas the private sector jobs have recovered over 100% because they've added jobs. And so that is going to be a dynamic that I think Jonathan hit on as to why interest arbitration or conciliation or fact finding is going to probably be a larger component of future bargaining.
And Mike, I'll jump in with a question for you. Would you agree with me that it doesn't matter whether you call it fact finding, conciliation, interest arbitration, you prepare for your case exactly the same way?
Yeah, I mean, in Ohio, fact finding is the fact finder has some leadway to find some middle ground or pick either party's side. In conciliation, the statutory conciliation in Ohio, it's pick one or the other on an issue, as opposed to giving the fact finder leadway. So yeah, it is the same. The factors that you have to prepare for are the same.
Dave, I'll take that a half a step farther. The factors for fact finding conciliation in Ohio are virtually the same. The key difference is, to go to conciliation, you have to do last best offer, which does not exist in all the statutes out there that have interest arbitration. So I'm not exactly certain why, even though I was in the rooms when it was being discussed, I still don't find quite the substantial backing for having two steps that are almost identical in what factors are to be considered, except that the fact finder, as Mike indicated, can find a middle ground or different ground or massage the issues, whereas the last best offer conciliation in Ohio forces the parties to come to a little bit more of an agreement. So to me, I look at the factors for fact finders, conciliators, when I begin preparing for negotiations. And I tell my clients at the end of one contract is when you start looking at that list in preparation for the next, because all those factors that they have to look at is what you have to prepare for in the negotiations. And that's, to me, that's been one of the key things in educating people who are at the table, regardless of whether or not I'm representing them, is this is what a fact finder is statutorily required to review. This is what a conciliator or interest arbitration is statutorily required to review. And what do those terms mean?
And you should be pulling that data, as Jonathan said, before bargaining starts. I mean, you should have some idea of where this is likely to go. Now, bargaining takes a while, so things could change. You have to keep up with the data, but if you don't understand the factors and the data going in, you can't decide whether you should take the deal the employer's offering or whether you should go to fact finding and see where you can get more.
Okay, and I'm going to jump in here with a question for Ms. Scott, because Mike and Jonathan, your problem is you both know what you're doing and you are very sophisticated. So I'm going to ask Ms. Scott, whose practice extends from the Arctic Circle to the Mexican border, what you sometimes see in smaller jurisdictions and how they get into problems with interest arbitration.
Well, one of the biggest problems that I see is the statute does not provide the factors for the fact finder or the arbitrator to determine. So then we get things all over the place that make no sense. I had one in Cake, Alaska, where literally there was very little data. The union wanted to be able to cash out their retirement benefits, 5 days of sick leave, but they didn't give me any comparator data. That told me what is the total compensation that other teachers within your jurisdiction get as opposed to what you get. They didn't tell me anything. So unfortunately I had to say, sorry, it's not going to go into your contract because you didn't give me enough information.
So do you routinely see both employers and unions coming to what I'll call interest arbitration without total compensation data?
Yes, and that's the biggest problem that I see is if I don't know what the total compensation they receive, and when I say total compensation, I'm not just talking about what their wages are, I'm talking about what are their total benefits that they receive, sick leave, health insurance, that kind of thing. If you don't give me all of that information, it's very hard to determine if whatever the proposal is should be put into the contract.
If there's no comparability data and there's no total compensation data, what do? Do you just do what you think is fair, or do you just split the baby and cut it in half?
I go with the status quo. I probably would use the status quo doctrine in that situation, and that's where a party is proposing new contract language that then they have the burden of proving that there should be a change to the status quo. If they can't do that, then we're just going to stay with the status quo.
Okay, and Mike, I want to go back to you because Jonathan talked a little about what he's seen kind of happening in the past 2 years, and we'll come back to him in a little bit. But what changes, what have you seen happening in the past few years that's different?
Well, I think you can see if you look at the SERB data, the fact finders are averaging over 5%. Fact finders and conciliators are averaging 5% for the last quarter of 2021. And that's two factors are driving that. One, inflation, and two, the scarcity of labor and the fact that 58% of the public sector jobs in the nation have not been have not recovered from the pandemic. They can't find people to be teachers. They can't find people to be cops, firemen, correction officers, direct care workers at mental health and mental retardation institutions. It's hard work. The the total compensation probably is not bad, but the money is not worth it when you look at the potential for getting into a lawsuit. I mean, you have the right attacking teachers and you have the left attacking cops, and you have so much potential now. And if you're working in a mental health or mental retardation facility, to be accused of abuse and have to go through that process. So there's a lot of job items that seem to make it not an attractive job if you have other skills.
Jonathan, what do you see happening over the past couple of years? What's changing?
Money. The focus has been on money, and that, to the chagrin of a lot of administrators that I work with, saying, look at this great benefit package you have, and to a person almost, they say, the new applicants, the recruits, don't look at the pension that's out there. They don't look at the days off. They look at what's going to be in their paycheck. And so the focus of the workforce has changed. We've seen the shelter mentality as well from current employees, where they were locked into a shelter, their fire stations, their police stations, or they're working at home remotely as a school teacher, versus the corrections officers who had to be in with the prisoners, and the police officers on the street. But so it's the dopamine effect of the COVID right now that's also overwhelming, and the question about the money, because money doesn't solve everything, but that's what I'm hearing in terms of getting recruits in. But then we have this, and I know it's going on nationally, David, that, people stealing from one place to the other. City of Phoenix advertising in Cleveland for police officers to move to Phoenix, Arizona. And so we're seeing this just dullness over the negotiations, as opposed to let's get in and talk about what we can do across the board. And the attitude toward public services, as Mike has indicated, is impacted by a number of different factors. And I know Kristen has seen this issue on the state level in a classic for her, except for firefighters. Kristen's responsible for almost every job category there is in the public sector.
Hey, Kristen, what have you seen?
I agree. I think money has definitely been more of a factor, and I think it actually remains to be seen if some of the changes in compensation are really doing a lot to impact that recruitment. But I think I think I've seen a bigger effort on the part of public sector employers to try to promote the benefits of public sector jobs, which I think maybe were taken for granted previously, that people would just understand the benefits of public sector. I think we have to do a better job now of getting out there and recruiting those employees. So I think that's been a very big change. I also think, I think Janice has had a big impact at the bargaining table. And I think that it has, made a difference in terms of our ability to reach an agreement at the table instead of using the procedures that we're here to talk about today.
Okay, and let's move on to slide 8. And Ms. Scott, when we talk about ability to pay cases, explain to me how that works at the hearing. Who's got the burden of proof? Who traditionally, presents the ability to pay? How does that go down?
Put me on the spot, why don't you? Usually it's the employers has the burden of proof on ability to pay. They need to bring it up during bargaining from the beginning, not just when you get to interest arbitration. That should be, just like Jonathan and Mike talked about, they should be looking at these issues way in advance of ever getting to the bargaining table, so that by the time they get to an interest arbitration situation where the arbitrator, the neutral, has to make a decision one way or the other. They need to prove it.
And have you seen an ability to pay case? I mean, a real ability to pay case in the last 10 years?
Many times.
I mean, have you seen one that the employer has won in the past 10 years?
I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
So we're getting
Not really, no.
yeah.
Because
So
of inflation, because of taxes, the employer likes to argue that they can't, but normally, at the bottom line is they can. Maybe they just don't want to, but they can.
going back to 2008, 2009, back when things were really tough, then were employers winning?
That's when employers were winning on that issue. Absolutely.
And Jonathan, what's your experience, going back 30 years with ability to pay cases? Do you think they're cyclical?
Definitely on a cycle, Dave. I haven't even tried to make an inability to pay argument in the last 10 years. I use a limited ability to pay based on comparables, but only during the recession did any of that really come about. And I had one particular case in Youngstown for the county up there, where it was a very difficult situation because there were major cuts that were made in that negotiation. But since then, no. I don't know that we're going to be headed that way. The fiscal people, the economists that I deal with, are being cautious and not cautiously optimistic, but just cautious going forward, coming off of this bubble of money that local governments receive from the feds. The one-time money does not make for long-term planning. So I think we may be into it here in a little bit. And I'm thinking maybe 24, maybe 25, 2024, 2025, but absolutely not, David, not for the last 10 years. But Kristen and I had a situation where we did deal with it. And I think Kristen can point out the difficulty of trying to bring that issue up at the table.
Yes, so I'm sure many of you are aware that we recently went through a conciliation process with the state troopers, we weren't making a complete inability to pay argument there, but the state's funding is complicated, and depending on which group of employees you are looking at, they are funded in very different ways. And the state troopers are funded on a fee basis. They are funded by driver's license fees and motor vehicle registrations. And that is really a non-growing revenue source. So this was something that we had to, as we were preparing for the negotiations, we had to get a much better understanding of ourselves, and then we had to work to, make sure we were presenting the right information to the neutrals in our process to understand that, yes, if you look at the state budget, it is huge, but this is the money that is purposed for this group of employees. So it was a challenging, it was certainly challenging, and we were not arguing, that we couldn't afford any kind of increase, but we certainly were saying that it had to be, a reasonable increase.
Well, I was the chief spokesperson for the state in 2008 for the employer at that point in time. And when the recession hit, we tried to stay away from the ability to pay because the state's funding is complicated. I don't think the state ever proved that they have an inability to pay. And so we did not utter those magic words to put the burden of proof on us. In deference to OSTA, I would say with the state's rainy day fund, they would have a very hard time proving an ability to pay at all. The rainy day fund is at its highest level right now that it ever has been. It was high at the time of COVID. And the state had put off collecting income tax for 2 months. So they thought they had this huge deficit, but when they collected income tax on July 15th instead of April 15th, it wasn't so much. So the state's funding is very complicated with the federal money, the state money, all that. And so it would be almost impossible for the state to have an ability to pay. Because they didn't budget it and it's sitting in the rainy day fund, doesn't mean that they couldn't pay.
And the rainy day fund, certainly does become an issue. But, the rainy day fund really is only going to cover the state for a few months of total operations. It is one-time money. So to talk about using the rainy day fund for ongoing increases is a bit of a problem. I see Jonathan smiling at me. I forgot this, I say this over and over again.
Yeah, but it's still like you had a surplus of 1.8 million 2 fiscal years ago. You had a surplus of 2 million, I believe, this past year, something like that. You stocked away a lot of money in the rainy day fund. That's the other factor you're going to want to look at. You're going to want to look at what employers have carried over each fiscal year, because they always say they're broke.
Dave and Shianne,
I want to show that evidence is there, that they are just very conservative budgeters, and
right.
If they've carried over all this money year after year for 10 years, that you can't trust their numbers.
Dave, if I can, what Mike and Kristen are talking about is, specific funding source, which exists at all levels of government in Ohio, rainy day fund versus other things. And then you have legislative changes, which we had in Ohio a few years ago, where they eliminated what rhetorically called the death tax or the estate tax, which was a huge generator of revenue for some jurisdictions. I think the point that I'd like to throw out there is, when you look at it collectively, you have to look at each jurisdiction and determine if there are specific funding sources, and what is those revenues? Is it property tax, which is more static than income tax, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when a union comes to the table and says, we want more money, but doesn't say why they believe more money is there from whatever source, then we have to look at what are those funding sources? Where is it going to come from? How is it going to be paid for? What is the short-term, long-term projections? And quite honestly, the big struggle that I'm facing with a lot of clients right now at the table is, what do we do with this ARPA money? What do we do with it? Who do we spend it on? How is it spent? What are the policy decisions? And what I do as a negotiator, where I know there's going to be some questions about the budget as opposed to the comparables, is I typically put an economics or budget person at the table at the first or second session of negotiations. I've done this with one jurisdiction every round of negotiations for the last 20 some years. The budget person is the first person to present, and all the documentation is there. With Kristen and Mike, we did the same thing. We put the budget person at the table the very first session with a slideshow, because it takes more time to figure out the money than it is to figure out some of the mechanical provisions in a contract.
And when I was
money is black and white. It's either there or it's not, or where.
And when I was chief spokesperson for OCB and during the Great Recession, one of the things that I told the governor's office that we needed to do was do a presentation to all the unions sooner than later, not as we approached each table, but do one earlier before we got to the table. We had to establish some belief in the credibility of the numbers. People don't believe finance people. And they, just like statisticians, they don't believe statisticians or finance people. So you have to establish some credibility. So repetition is your friend in this process. As Jonathan said, he does it, first or second session. We did it before the bargaining started, then in the second session, and then, we just wanted to establish that we did have an issue, and that we needed help solve it. And so I think that is something, I think the problem is there's a lot of people that claim that they don't have the money because they don't want to pay. But hopefully operations are now dictating that they need to pay so that they can get people to recruit and retention issues are evolving because we have a scarcity of labor in America.
Okay,
Shianne, do you see unions coming to the table with a robust economic or budget presentation? I mean, there's a couple other factors in the previous slide about the demographics as well as economics and wage comparisons. What kind of information do you see unions bringing to the table at the hearings?
Not much. I don't see that very often at all. However, when I was at the city, I saw that last bullet point right there. Did the union participate in the budget process? One of my unions did that, and he understood, the advocate for the union understood intimately the city's budget process. And so when we got to the table where there wasn't all this back and forth, oh, you have it, no, we don't have it kind of thing. He knew exactly what went into the budget process. And I would encourage union advocates to do that going forward.
well, let's talk a little bit about the sophistication of the parties, and let's go to slide 10. And arbitrator Scott, I'll throw you under the bus to start like I usually do. Can you give us a 20-second view of what total compensation is?
Total compensation, that is a very good question. I'm going to just quote from the book, if I can, what total compensation actually means. It doesn't, like I said before, it doesn't just mean wages. It goes far beyond what wages they're paid. It includes the health care. It includes their days off, their paid time off. It includes virtually anything that you can think that involves around money. It includes that. Like, for example, clothing allowance. Do you have a clothing allowance if you're a police officer? That's going to be part of their compensation package. You need to look at all of those things when you're determining what the total compensation is.
Okay, and you've seen some very sophisticated cases, but you've seen very unsophisticated cases as well. So
Correct.
unlike Mike and Jonathan, you can talk about what happens when it goes south. How does that happen in terms of the total compensation data?
Well, then I have to say in my award, unfortunately, the record is devoid of any comparable total compensation package compared to the bargaining unit. So as I said before, it's status quo. I can't help you if you don't give me the data.
And I'll tell a brief story here. I mean, I recently had a case and it involved a community college district that was very unsophisticated. They were represented by a huge law firm. I mean, a firm that has more than 1,000 attorneys, but they didn't understand interest arbitration or conciliation. And they wanted to get rid of retiree medical. So their argument to me was retiree medical's bad. And I agree with that argument. If you're an employer, retiree medical is bad. And the union's argument was retiree medical is good. And I agree with that argument. If you're the working guy out there in the union, retiree medical is good. But the employer, they couldn't tell me whether these people were the highest paid, community college teachers in the state, the lowest paid. They had no idea of their comparable jurisdictions. They just wanted to talk about whether something's good or bad. And when that happens, what's the outcome? The employer is going to lose every single time is they're proposing a change and they simply haven't met their burden of proof as to total compensation. Jonathan, what do you see in terms of the sophistication of your clients when it comes to total comp data?
Well, if you put the budget person at the table, that person sees all the costs. And in Ohio, we have Dave and Shianne, we have a great reporting system through CERB on costs of health insurance and impact. That's why I always reach in to find the finance director, the auditor, the fiscal officer, whomever, to bring that person into the mix and to add it all up. The problem you run into is the devil of how do you show the value of it, because what's the value of a vacation day in one jurisdiction versus another in terms of dollars and cents. So we have to add up what I call PTO or pay time off charts, as well as the actual costs. And that's where we have to blend it together. And there's only one computer program that I'm aware of that's still in an infancy that actually adds up all those costs and puts values to them based on the wage rates in a jurisdiction, et cetera. So it's not something we've seen in the Midwest other than on a case-by-case basis. And I would like to know from Dave, from you and Shianne, with your national experience, are you seeing jurisdictions actually coming in with dollars and cents comparisons, which includes all of the cost items such as vacations and holidays and uniforms, et cetera? Are you seeing that, Shianne?
I don't see that often enough. I wish that I did. I wish that employers had advocates like you, Jonathan, that would kind of guide them in the process, have the budget person at the table from the beginning, have all those numbers that includes the total compensation. I cannot emphasize that enough, because I can't just looking at wages is not going to be enough information to say, is this a comparable to what the bargaining unit is asking for?
And
I don't think you can do it in dollars and cents in Ohio yet. I mean, I know Montgomery must have got to you too, Jonathan, because he's called me about that computer program. But you can compare the number of vacation days, the number of sick days. You can compare the cost of healthcare, right? It may not be completely dollars and cents, but if somebody's getting 15 sick days instead of 10, that's somewhat of a comparison. And so you can do that. I think our biggest problem is fighting about what is the comparable jurisdiction.
yeah, well, let me ask you this. So what I see is the majority of political subdivisions are very unsophisticated. That's because for every Cleveland, Columbus, or Cincinnati, you've got 100, township of Buffalo Lick, with a population of 800 people. So when I do statutory interest arbitrations in Hawaii. So when we do those, I am doing the wages, hours, and working conditions for every firefighter in Hawaii. There's 14 statutory bargaining units. And I'm doing it for last one was the white collar professionals, but it was everyone who worked for the state and who worked for every one of the counties. And they don't have cities in Hawaii, they only have counties. And then, the issue becomes, and I'll throw this one to Mike and Jonathan, what do you do about the firefighters when, the firefighters in Maui and firefighters in Ohio, please don't get your hopes up on ever getting this. They've got a call out premium where if their precious sleep as a firefighter is disturbed after 8 p.m., they get, I think it's an extra $100. And the question is, how does that fit into, net hourly compensation or total compensation? Mike and Jonathan, and Kristen, I care very much about your opinion.
Well, the way I see it, I mean, it's hard to factor all those things in, and that's probably why it makes it so hard to come up with really comparable total compensations, because unless you dig through every contract that's served, you're not going to know those numbers. CERB does put out reports about the percentage of increases, but it doesn't include the other compensation, like if there's been an adjustment to classification. You can get like if you wanted to look at a health department, you can go to CERB and say, can you give me all the health department's data on what they get paid, so that you can look at that and compare those. You can have some comparables there. With the state, it's extremely hard to compare other jurisdictions.
Well, Kristen went through this process. Kristen, I think your experience of what you and your staff did on a couple of those would be very helpful.
So let me start with the total compensation piece. Yes, I think there are definitely pieces that are difficult, but I think there are a lot of things that we can we can put into a cost and say, this is the cost of X type of employee, right? And include all of those things: uniform allowance, cleaning allowances, all of those things that roll up that employees do get on a regular basis. When you're talking about something like, Dave, your example with the firefighters and that call out pay, I think as an employer, what I would look at is the frequency of that call out pay. If that's something that one employee is getting, once a year, twice a year,
Okay.
I probably wouldn't give it that much value. But if it's regular, I'd look at an average.
Kristen, I'll cut you off. So I'm going to change my what if. The paramedics in Honolulu are getting called out 3 times a night and explaining to people why grandma isn't breathing. The paramedics in Kona get called out once every 3 weeks. What do you do about that?
I'd probably look at an average. I mean, because I think that is part of their compensation. If it is regularly occurring in one jurisdiction versus not regularly occurring in another jurisdiction, I think, it's part of the
it's all the same. It's all the same. All these people get the exact same wages, hours, and working conditions. You're saying
they get it less frequently, you're saying, though, right? So
correct. So think in terms of the state patrol, where you've got people, living in, their detachments working out of downtown Cleveland, and you've got other people whose detachment is working out of someplace near the Indiana border where nobody ever goes.
Right. So if there's a type of pay that you only get on a situational basis, I would look at the frequency of it and try to figure out some sort of average to put in there, right? Like, say this pay occurs on average, this frequently, and so we can kind of cost that much to it.
And I'm going to go back and I'm going to address one of the questions that's in the chat box. And I might have been unclear. What happens when the employer doesn't bring good net hourly compensation or total compensation data? Here's what happens in real life. So I'm the best interest arbitrator in the state of Wyoming because I'm the only interest arbitrator in the state of Wyoming. But I go to a small town, and the small town brings the dude from finance in who's got no total compensation data. And he's, wearing a brown suit, there's gravy stains on his tie, the deal. The IAFF flies in 3 people from Rockville, Maryland, who have all these initials after their names, like, PhD, they have degrees in compensation science. And then they come in and testify, and they give me what may or may not be really good compensation data. I don't know for sure because the employer isn't sophisticated enough to cross-examine them. That's where the unions, and pardon my language, really open a can of whoop ass on the employer. I mean, if you've got a union that is far more sophisticated and they're flying in, You know, when I go to Hawaii, the experts come, you know, for the union. It's that Will Aitchison guy flying in to testify. And for the employer, it's someone from one of the, you know, big 3 or 4 consulting companies, you know, Marsh or Aon, and they're flying in from Chicago or New York. I mean, that's a fair fight. The problem is when you don't have a fair fight. But then I'm going to encourage all the other panelists to go back and look at the chat questions. And unfortunately, we've got to move on a little bit here. Let's move on to slide 11 and talk about the cost of living and COLA, which was something I didn't care about 5 years ago, but I sure care about now. Hey, Mike, have you seen any changes?
I mean, I believe inflation is 7.1. It may have dissipated more since the last time I looked, but last time I looked, it was 7.81 or 7.1 nationally. So I think, you know, that's the CPI, but then you have to look at the CPI Midwest index, the CPIU, and that probably gives you a better, you know, handle on regionally where you're at. You have the BLS labor statistics for metro areas. I think the biggest thing that we're seeing is, again, the scarcity of labor. You have to look at the employers in your jurisdictions now, not just what is the comparable jurisdictions with you, but what are generally employers paying? I mean, so we have Cane's Chicken paying $16 an hour, and after 2 years, after 2 months, and you get some training, you're jumping to $18 an hour, and you have somebody at Franklin County Children's Services who's making $13.96. Well, you have all these other benefits. You know, it's going to be hard to attract people to that. So I think you have to, you know, public employers are going to have to look not only at what has been traditional comparables, but also what is going on in the general economic environment in their region. Because, like, okay, let's just bring into the fact that Intel's coming to Ohio, and those jobs for technical jobs are going to be $135,000 a year, plus good benefits. Especially Central Ohio, you have Nationwide. They have good benefits and they have good compensation. You have Ohio State University. You have Franklin County. So you know, this state has 32% of its workforce in Franklin County, and so when you're looking at all those other employers, that's who you're really competing with, because there is only one labor market. And I know public employers don't like to hear this, but there's one labor market. There isn't two. There isn't one for the private sector and one for the public sector. That's a political argument. That's not reality. And so we have to convince arbitrators, if you're a union, that there is one labor market, and you need to be looking at all the data to come up with a compensation package that allows the employer to recruit and retain employees so that they can run their operation.
Hey, Dave,
Yes, sir.
I'd like to hear from you and Shianne what you two are seeing parties present from this particular list that you have on cost of living, and what you find persuasive as a neutral. And so that to me is important, because this issue of cost of living is a national issue. It's not an Ohio issue. It's not a Butler County issue. It's a national issue in terms of overall issues. So what are you seeing the parties advance, and what do you, either side, and what do you see as convincing?
And I'll say this, Shianne and I are always the last to know, you know, when there's a new wave of cases, because we're coming in the back end. So those 2008, 2009 cases with, you know, 0% increase or a decrease in wages, We didn't see those until 2010, 2011. So we're always a year behind. But what I like about you and Mike is that you guys are really old. So you went through the cola wars in the late 80s, you know, and I'm gonna say some things that maybe I shouldn't, but I talk to other arbitrators, and I'll tell you, sometimes the more sophisticated arguments on the COLA, they don't understand them. If they would have been good at math, they would have gone to med school, you know, they wouldn't be labor relations professionals. And you can get too complicated. And conciliators, labor arbitrators also tend to be relatively conservative, and they get freaked out by big numbers. You know, I don't think Shianne does. But some of them, you know, the thought of a 6-7% increase is, you know, frightens them. But you get to some of these metropolitan statistical areas, and some of these MSAs, you know, you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, and the BLS data is frightening. It shows, you know, inflation running 8.5%. And then we're seeing things. I know, Shianne, you had a recent case, and I don't want to divulge the city, with 911 operators, where you had a dispute as to what their turnover ratio was. And what was the dispute between the parties?
They both agreed that they had retention issues, ability to attract issues. And to your question, Jonathan, you asked, what do you find persuasive when we're talking about the cost of living? What happened in that situation is the union presented a very good case that because the cost of living was so high and the wages of those 911 operators were so low, and that was not just in their jurisdiction, that was across the country that they were having these issues. That was persuasive to me.
Well, if I remember right, the employer said, oh, our turnover rate is only about 50%. Well, the union said, no, it's more like 67%. And, you know, Arbitrator Scott found it doesn't matter. I mean, I mean, you need people to pick up the phone. And I don't know what we're going to do about that. I mean, I was in Arbitrator Scott home jurisdiction when a friend of mine, Judge Williams, had a heart attack, and I got to call 911 in Portland, Oregon. And I was on hold for 18 minutes.
My God.
You know, I mean, push 1 if you're having a heart attack. You know, if grandma's dead, push 2. It's frightening out there. But the fighting over which index to use, I mean, Jonathan, Mike, I haven't seen that in 30 years. I mean, have you seen?
I don't think we fight about the indexes. I think we fight about what is a comparable jurisdiction, right? Is it, you know, I think Kristen hit on it when she talked about what they did with OSTA. I mean, OSTA, the troopers are in every county. So what is the comparable jurisdiction? You know, again, if I'm the union, I'm going to look at where do you have more troopers? Is it in the metro areas, or is it in BFE? Well, they present data on BFE, but the majority of your troopers are in metro areas. And therefore, you know, you need to compare them to the metro jurisdiction. That would be an argument that you would have. But all I'm saying is, I think employers and you know, when I was on the state side, we used to like to use the Great Lakes jurisdiction in terms of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, as the comparables, and when we wanted to keep the wages lower, we tried to throw in West Virginia and Indiana and Kentucky, but are those really comparable? They don't have collective bargaining and they're right to work states, they're poor, and so you have fights about that. What is the comparable jurisdiction? If you're in Lakewood, subdivision of Cleveland, what is your comparables with Lakewood?
Yeah, I'm gonna cut you off, Mike, because we're gonna move on after the break to comparable jurisdictions. But back in the old days when we were fighting over CPI, the arguments were you can't use CPI because it overstates inflation. And let's go through, the slide very quickly. The substitution argument, people understand that. Hey, the price of pork has doubled, but you can eat chicken instead, and chicken's the same price. So even though the CPI might have increased, the impact on the employees isn't as great. Jonathan and Mike, going back to the olden days, did you ever see that argument work?
Oh, yeah.
No, I think the numbers in the indexes are the numbers in the indexes, and trying to argue that they're less or more. I mean, now on Facebook, or in the media, you'll see, because they want to hype up inflation, that they say CPI is lower than real inflation now. Back then they were saying CPI was less than real inflation. All depends on what you want. If you want a Social Security increase, you're going to say, it's higher. And if you want to, if you're the employer and you want to say that it's going to be lower. So I think the indexes speak for themselves, and I don't think neutrals really buy into this idea that there's substitution.
Okay, but Mike, Jonathan's going to say that you're wrong. And one of the reasons you're wrong is you've forgotten about the housing component. So let's say that price of housing in Cincinnati doubles. But hey, all the firefighters and all the cops, they already own their houses anyway. So why should it matter? Isn't that overstated by inflation?
Does all the fighters and cops own their houses?
Well, you get to the housing component issue, especially now, and not just Central Ohio, in many parts of the country, the housing shortage that's out there, and that's a much bigger issue for us economically and socially. But absolutely, if I didn't have an issue with the cost of the housing in a particular jurisdiction, and that's one of the demographic numbers that I ask clients to look at all the time. What is the value of your house in this jurisdiction versus the other comparable jurisdictions? So not to go into that other slide yet, but the housing component argument is part of the cost of living as well, and it does come up on comparables.
Well, I would say that that's been correct for the last couple of years because of, the acceleration of the price of housing, especially in Central Ohio. But I also know that my son just moved to Arizona, and so when looking at where houses are falling in value, since there was this big uptick, there's a lot of jurisdictions where now houses are falling in value. And Central Ohio is not one of those. Central Ohio's housing is holding its value, but Nashville, I believe, is dropped from its highest. So it is a component that you need to look at.
Well, what are you gentlemen seeing in terms of the cost for a good full family health plan? Are you pushing up against $2,000 a month in Ohio?
That's the cheap one. You're talking $2,400 to as high as $3,600 a month for a family plan. And quite honestly, it was good to point out that that's the one thing that I want to put on the table early is what does the city pay for your health insurance coverage? And how can you help in that arena as well? Because I use a very simple line. Every dollar you pay for health insurance is $1 less available for wages. And
So
then
you
we're
see,
working on an education program.
so you see health insurance running at about $10 an hour for some employees.
Yeah.
And I take it your argument is that's why you don't have to use CPI, because the employer is paying the vast majority of the medical increases. So
The statewide average is 15% employee contribution, but then you can set that aside when you look at all the out-of-pocket expenses that are out there, which we, as I said earlier, we have a very good source for comparisons for those employers with union contracts. It's all at CERB. They have a million point database on health insurance, and 90+% response rate to their annual survey. But the key for an employer to show is, hey, here's how much it costs, and here's what you get for coverage. And yeah, maybe you have a $5,000 deductible, but only 3 people out of 150 actually even got to that amount. So just like back at the budget situation, I find so many unions are unwilling to learn about the cost of health insurance and then how they can become good consumers of medical insurance by education process. And that, if I don't have it resolved at the table, that's exactly the same presentation that I'm going to make to a neutral.
Oh, and no offense, trying to ask the employee to navigate healthcare and be a good consumer when the healthcare system is broken in America and you can't get transparency of price on anything is a bullshit argument.
Well, that's where Mike and I obviously disagree a little bit, regardless of whether or not you think the system is broken or not. The employer still pays, and the employer can show.
No, the employer pays, but
where the
what
money
I'm
is
trying to
going.
say, Jonathan, it's a false premise to believe that an employee can navigate and be a better consumer to save you money. That is a false premise.
Well, Mike,
that is a premise that is driven by politics and not reality again.
Well, the reality is I've had jurisdictions where it has worked, so I will have to respectfully disagree. But that gets back to, if they can't navigate it, go talk to the people in HR who do navigate it and have them work with you as your ombudsman. You can't just throw up your arms and say someone else pays for it, because you're the consumer.
okay.
So we're going to agree to disagree on that point.
Well,
I think if you wanted to fix healthcare in America and keep the costs low, you would regulate the provider.
okay. Well, what a perfect time to take a 10-minute break. Does anybody want to stay on the screen and answer questions while we take a break?
Sure, I'll stay on.
I
Okay.
can't do.
I'm not. I will see you back here at 9:19.
No, 12:19. That tells everybody that, and I just want to emphasize this, Dave and Shianne are coming to us from the West Coast. It's 9 o'clock in their world. And I work with Dave speaking at a couple of national conferences. And the goal was to bring in people to explain how the process works, and literally for everybody in Ohio to emphasize, and most people know this, but Ohio's not just an island out there. We're part of a larger continent, and the issues that face interest arbitration are the same in Honolulu as they are in Broadview Heights, Ohio. To me, it's trying to get people to look at this thing in a more global fashion. And, Mike and I can debate about any number of issues, but you get resolution by laying the information out there. And if one party or the other wants to push an issue, then that's where we get to fact finding and conciliation.
And I would just like to plug CERB, because CERB has a robust data operation, and
Yeah.
they've been very helpful in when I, contacted them. We also use the international to benchmark classifications, things of that nature. The real issue, though, is things may be named differently in jurisdictions, and so you don't really get a pure. It's not always apples to apples, but it gives you some idea. And
Right.
I just like to say that Justin Brown does a great job at SERB in terms of
Yep. Justin, Sherry, all of them.
if you want to get information, they can get it. Sometimes it's a little behind the curve, and
So, Mike, there was one question that came up that says, I'm not understanding if employer doesn't bring the total financial package to fact finding, and the union is asking for a raise since you can't make a decision on this. Isn't that unfair to the union if the employer doesn't bring the information to the table and refuses to give the union the full picture? This person then writes, I've been involved in negotiations where we have had to ask for financial information 2 and 3 times because we get it in pieces.
yeah, I think it's a
go to a
problem
smaller
in the
jurisdiction
smaller
and-
jurisdictions. It's
Think about
smaller
local
juris-
jurisdictions, Mike, as opposed to the state on this one.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's a problem in the smaller jurisdictions. Like I'm dealing with the Trumbull County Board of Health. They don't have anything on the website about their budget, or so you have to do public records requests. They're slow in fulfilling those. There's all those kind of little games that they try to play. I think with the state, it's not. The state OBM files a monthly report to you. It's transparent. Where what the numbers are. You see the revenue. You see the expenditures. It's much easier at the state level as a union to know what's going on, because OBM has to file that monthly report. That would be something that, if the legislature wanted to do something that was good, and they would require all jurisdictions to do a monthly report. But that's not going to happen. So, you're going to have to go through the public records request. But I don't think you heard the fact finder or the neutrals correct. I think what they said is the person asking for the change in language has to prove that they need it. Now on money, inability to pay is on the employer. You're going to be arguing, and there's going to be data given. You're not always going to have total compensation. I mean, that's the best of all worlds if you can figure out what total compensation is and you can make comparables. But in a lot of places, you're just going to not have total compensation. And you're going to be using the percentages, the averages that SERB gives.
Right.
Any kind of comparables you can find from asking for, like, let's look at every I have Franklin County JFS, so let's look at every county JFS office and then try to look at what people are making in classifications that seem similar, by name, caseworker, secretary. Those are the kinds of things that you can compare, but you're not always going to have total compensation. It's not always transparent. Again, that's like in a perfect world. But you can, say, well, they have 10 sick days instead of 15. And I think the employer would make that argument that, hey, we give 15 sick days. If you want that higher pay, then you should take 5 less sick days, right? I don't want to speak for Jonathan, but I think, that would be an employer argument.
Yep. And so, Mike, back to the original question, I would suggest to you, if I were on the union side and the management, the employer does not provide the economics, then point that out to the arbitrator, because as Mike said, the moving party has the burden of proof. And if they're saying they can't afford something, or they have a limited ability, but they didn't provide you the documentation during the course of negotiations, then they're going to have an uphill battle on their position. And it's basically probably going to boil down to comparables as opposed to what's in the budget or not in the budget. I mean, I've had it
I
where.
agree with that. I think, some people try to file an unfair labor practice. It's served, I find that just to delay negotiations, to tie things up. You probably are better going forward to fact finding, making those arguments that the employer didn't provide you the information and therefore, it should be construed against them.
Yeah. An unfair labor practice charge for failure to provide the information requested. There's, all you're doing is making a lawyer's job, because then we can come back and argue all kinds of things. And this isn't the
Well,
private sector where
the
that
other
becomes a
option
huge
is go to
battle.
court of claims now. It's $25 and you make a public records request. They don't fulfill the public records request. Go to court of claims, but even their speedy process isn't so speedy. So again,
That's right.
anytime you go to court, delays things. And so, I find that as an advocate, you're often left with imperfect data and you have to make do with what you have. It's not always going to be pristine. But I didn't hear the neutral say that they wouldn't give a raise if they didn't have total compensation. They said they would rather have total compensation to help them make those comparisons, right? But sometimes it's imperfect data. But
Well, I guarantee you, well, I shouldn't say this. If I'm the arbitrator, good luck getting anything past COLA if you don't have total compensation data. I mean, because
and really, total compensation helps the employer more than the union, right? I mean, because you may be high in healthcare, and so you may not want to be like, okay, well, our healthcare dollars, right? So it's the employer's going to be more inclined to look at total compensation to kind of lower your argument.
I disagree with you, Mike. It's all based on who your comparables are. So
what I'm saying is total compensation is the best of all worlds if you can find it. Again, it's not always easy to compare. Total compensation in Ohio, do you compare it with Pennsylvania and Michigan? Do you compare it with Franklin County, Columbus, and Franklin County and Columbus and Cuyahoga County and Cleveland and Cincinnati and Hamilton? I mean, I think we get into fights about the jurisdictions, but also the data is not always easy to find and give to the neutral. And so it's usually more general data. You might be able to show that the percentage increases were this, the number of sick days were this, the number of vacation days were this, the number of personal days were this.
I mean, it's the killer for me is firefighters, where you got one jurisdiction working a modified Berkeley, you got another jurisdiction with, 2 3s, you got another where the hours are all over the board, the pre-scheduled overtime is all over the board. And in that case, the hourly wages, I don't want to say mean nothing, but they often mean very little. You hit a jurisdiction that has Kelly days or X days, and you end up comparing apples to kumquats based on base wages. But okay, so people are now back. So we have to clean it up and kind of get back on task. And I've always said the 3 most important things when dealing with interest arbitration are the comparables, and the comparables. Mike, Jonathan, what do you think?
That's where I banked my case on from the very beginning.
I think that's where we've been. I'm not sure that's going to be the most important thing if you really want to figure out how to recruit and retain people going forward with the scarcity of labor. I think I hit on, you're going to have the general unemployment numbers in the area, right? You're going to have what other big employers are paying. You know, if you're competing for finance people in the public sector, you're competing with Nationwide and you're competing with these other employers as well. And so I'm thinking that because of the change in the labor market, that the idea that comparables were the most important factor, they're still going to be very important, but I think there is some secondary data that you can use to show that the employer needs to do more to get people through the door and to keep.
Okay, Mike, this is what I heard you say. I heard you say, yeah, the comparables have been the biggest factor we deal with by a long shot for the past 10, 15 years. But now,
I'd say 20.
okay, now things are changing. It does. What I hear you saying is it doesn't matter what the comparables are. If you've got 50% vacancies and you can't hire those extra 80 cops you need.
Yeah, I think you're not, so for police officers, you're competing not only with other jurisdictions, but other employers in the area. How do you get people to want to be police officers? How do you get people to want to be teachers? I mean, there was a study just out that came out that showed that parents are very happy with their public schools, but they don't want their kids to work in them. So, and that's two factors. One is pay, and one is you know, mass shooting. So again, I think, you know, policymakers need to look at that going forward, and you know, and maybe change the paradigm that we view everything through, because as I keep saying, there is one labor market, there is not two.
Well, these arguments that you're making, have you yet made them to an interest arbitrator? Or is
No,
this,
but I've been lobbying you guys every time I get a chance.
well, no, but you're going to be making arguments. What you're doing is you're giving a peek in the bag to everyone here. You better expect those arguments in the next 2 years.
I would say that those are going to be valid arguments. I mean, if you're competing for talent, and as Jonathan said yesterday, he taught a master's class, and those guys were really good at negotiations, but they all could do a spreadsheet, but they're all going to the private sector.
Mhm.
Well, wake up, public sector. I mean, you have to compete with those private sector employers for talent. And
Well,
so either that or you're going to not be able to function.
it's much more, I think, more global than that. The turnover issue has been around since we've been negotiating. Some places have recruitment retention problems even when the economy was good. I have sheriffs who are finally now reaching back down into the tech schools to start programs to get young students to want to become a corrections officer or a police officer or deputy sheriff. Social workers have been a scarcity in my entire career. Good times, bad times. Who wants to be a social worker?
They don't pay social workers anything.
Extremely challenging because of the nature of the work. So if you go to Germany and look at how public servants are treated in another country versus here, you have the cultural reaction. Mike mentioned school teachers. My daughter's a school teacher. My daughter-in-law is a school teacher. My son-in-law is a professional tree hugger who does a forest service for the national government. The idea of going to the public service, public sector as a vocation has had some changes to the point now where we've got to compete on the market in the private sector. Mike is correct about that, but there's still a lot of people who come to public service because that's where they want to serve. That that's a cultural, that's a social issue that goes beyond economics and beyond whether or not there's one labor force, two labor forces, or 10 labor forces. You've got a whole series of factors there. It's who you're going to get to work when, and we've got to make it attractive to be able to want to work in the public sector, and factors such as the wages, et cetera, because the issue about recruiting and retaining, that's never changed. It's just gotten exacerbated in the last couple of years. But I saw that in the 80s.
Well, and I think you also had a change in pension systems in Ohio where they've gotten rid of a lot of the retiree healthcare where it's not a PPO or
Now that comes back to the healthcare issue, but at least we have a pension system that's not bankrupt like.
No, I get that.
states.
Well, what I'm trying to say though is when I came into state service in '85, you were going to do your 30. You were going to walk out the door with your pension, and you and your wife were supposed to be covered by your health insurance until you reach 65. Well, then they changed the rules in mid-game. That doesn't help public employers recruit either. I mean, that used to be a selling point. The selling point for me between the private sector and the public sector was you're going to do your 30 and you're going to walk out the door and you're going to be 50 some years old.
Okay,
Gentlemen,
gentlemen, I'm going to stop you. I want to ask you a question. And first, I'm going to make fun of myself because I want to talk about all of the conciliation awards in Ohio and I'm going to make air quotes here, jurisprudence in terms of, if you could call it case law. What do you do about all that jurisprudence where all of these awards state, well, you should only be, comparing cities to cities or counties to counties. You shouldn't be comparing them to private sector. What's going to happen when you go to trial on these arguments and you're faced with all that jurisprudence?
Well, in Ohio, or in every place, arbitration is there's no stare decisis in arbitration, right? Arbitration, each case is on its own merits, and I would be arguing that factors have changed since that award came out. I mean, we have one either fact finding or conciliation by a renowned arbitrator in Cleveland that basically said the employer can never show an ability to pay because they have the right to raise taxes. But the employers seem to ignore that one. So I think, when you want, you can find case law to support you, but you can also find arguments as to why things have changed. Now
would it be fair?
The labor market has changed.
Okay, Mike, what I heard you say is you can find case law that says anything. And now I'm going to put both you guys on the hook. And Jonathan, this is your opportunity to respond. And I'm going to ask you a tough question here. Do you think that there are a number of labor arbitrators who have done interest arbitrations that didn't really understand what was going on?
Oh, absolutely. To that, I would say, look, you're checking it out at the beginning. When you have a panel, can we find someone on that panel that we believe understands economics and budgets and labor trends? So the short answer to your question is yes. There are arbitrators that I've seen write decisions with absolutely no justification or connection to what was presented at a fact finding recently in a police department where both parties put on information, but the arbitrator made a choice based on strictly what the union had proposed on an ACB across the board wage increase. So that if you're going to have a good process, then I challenge the arbitrators to explain. Give me more than just, well, the party said this, the party said that. I find the union, I find the management more persuasive. we need some granular information there because we have to explain it to our respective bodies. And I have to go back to city councils and county commissioners. Mike's got to go back to bargaining units. And so
Yeah.
when you get into those sorts of comparisons and where the revenue flow is, the most complex that I have ever been involved with was with Kristen when we did the statewide contract. And Kristen deals with this on a day-to-day basis. She has employees covered by contracts in every county in Ohio, all 88 counties, from West Dump Truck, Ohio, to major metro Ohio. And so the comparisons and the data and the recruitment is a never-ending challenging process. And the one labor market is as Mike advocates, Kristen sees that everywhere, where in some of the rural jurisdictions, working for public sectors, that's an honorable position. In other positions, it's, oh, you can't get a job, so you work for government. The stigma. Kristen, any thoughts on what Mike and I've been debating for the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, I mean, I understand, where Mike's coming from, certainly, but yeah, we are looking at such a, diverse area where our employees are located. It does become a challenge to determine what's comparable. I think that it's going to be interesting in, Mike making his argument moving forward to see where that puts us. The statutory factor still requires us to look at comparables. So, from the employer's perspective, I think I would be prepared to look at both. I would be prepared to look at make my argument as to what I think is a comparable jurisdiction, as well as looking at the bigger picture of what the labor market is saying.
And I'm going to slow you down.
Can I add one thing?
Stop, Mike, stop. I'm going to slow you down. I want to get Ms. Scott in here.
All right.
And I want to do this where I can't tell her the name of the city where she did a recent arbitration. But it was in the Midwest, and you're muted now, Arbitrator Scott. But this was under a city ordinance providing for interest arbitration. And the city ordinance, one of the factors, it said, the comparable shall be public employers of like size in the same labor market. Do you remember that case?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And who did the employer propose as a number of their comparables?
Of several counties, and which was against what the ordinance or whatever it was resolution said. And so I didn't use the proposed counties that the employer wanted us to use. Now that's different, like in a 911 operator situation, you can compare cities to counties because cities often cover counties in their 911 operations. Okay. So it just depends on what kind of employer it is and what the statute says.
Did that ordinance, did the employer come forward and propose private sector comparables?
I don't remember that.
Oh, okay. See, I read your awards.
Remember?
So it all runs together in your mind. What you said is you were going to disregard the employer's private sector comparables because you were going to follow what is set forth in the ordinance.
I did say that.
You weren't going to go for what people are arguing are good ideas. And I'm going to throw something out there to Mike and Jonathan. I think there are places you can go where you can find excellent labor arbitrators who know a lot about interest arbitration and developed a high degree of skill. But I think those places that you go are nursing homes or cemeteries. Have you seen a change with the people who are actually making these decisions and who you can select from over the past 5-6 years?
Yeah.
I'm going to let Jonathan talk about the local jurisdictions, but at the state level, we do a MAD. And I think that a MAD is a mutually agreed dispute resolution model where we agree to who the fact finder is, as opposed to getting a list from CERB, right? So under that, the parties have more control over who that person is versus I'm going to get a list from CERB and then we're going to strike and end up with somebody we don't really trust or know. So You know, that's one thing. And the other thing I'd like to add is, which I was going to add, but this you went to Shianne, and she hit on it. The statutory provisions in Ohio provides a catch-all for other economic data that could be used in setting, you know, in determining those matters. And quite frankly, I was very successful at using that when we had the Great Recession. You know, what is the unemployment rate in Ohio? What is the unemployment rate in these counties? All those things that, you know, the employer uses to its advantage when times are bad, but when times are good, they want to say, well, those shouldn't count. And so I think, you know, to be fair, we've used that data before when times were bad. Now times have changed, times are better, and the labor market's changed, and I think that data is going to be persuasive.
Jonathan, what do you see in terms of who the conciliators are in Ohio in the lists?
Right. First, Chris, will you advance to slide 15, please? Well, we're seeing the old guard, so to speak, the ones that were coming into the process initially back in the 80s, and I know them or knew them when they were alive, being replaced as arbitrators and negotiators and union representatives are. You know, we've gone through generations. Now, I can tell you that it's at least 3, if not 4 generations, because the lifespan of a generation in this world is about 12 to 15 years, and we've been at it now for nearly 40 years. So what I'm seeing, and this was the really difficult situation, when we had the recession, things dried up and work for arbitrators dried up. There were fewer arbitrators coming into the business when we had the recession, where we would have some turnover and some replacement. We had turnover, but no replacement. So yeah, I did go visit some arbitrators in nursing homes, but I haven't visited any of them I knew that are in the graveyard yet, but maybe I should. But what you have is people who are coming into the business with limited experience in the budgetary issues, which is usually our area of impact, but several arbitrators who I can name specifically understand the granular operations of organizations, so they can talk about bid processing or pick a post or whatever. They're very, very good at that, but they don't have their arms around or a deep understanding of the budgetary process, which I get back to what I said earlier was, that's what I start off with. 2 explanations to begin with: health insurance and budgets. And then I repeat those presentations when we get to the impasse proceeding if we have to. What I have told clients is, it is your responsibility to educate the neutral. Don't expect that they're going to know. So for instance, in our conversation yesterday, we mentioned the CAFR. Well, you're not allowed to say CAFR anymore, it's ACFRA. So what is the ACFRA, right? Well, it is, I don't remember, but I just know it's the annual report that people put out there. If you can read one of those reports, and in Ohio, they're all online at the state auditor's office, do you really understand it? And I will tell you that most union folks don't understand it because it's not in their wheelhouse. They're not, it's not their responsibility to understand it. It's management's responsibility to sit down and walk through it and explain it. I'll go back to one of your bullet points earlier on. Very, very, very few jurisdictions do I ever find out that someone from the union has actually been at the table or at least attended a city council meeting where the budget's been discussed, until such time as they want an economic increase. So if you're going to press for economic issues, then you need to be present. You need to be there when the sausage is being made. And I worked in a meatpacking house for several summers, so I've seen the process there and the budget process. So, but unfortunately, Dave, the short answer to your question is no.
And
most do not understand economics or budgets.
And Mike and Jonathan, would you both agree with me that there are arbitrators who are, would you both agree with me that 99% of the labor arbitration cases are either, hey, does Bob get his job back? Or what does this incoherent language in the collective bargaining agreement mean?
Right.
And that interest arbitrations or conciliations are less than 1% of the total cases.
Yep.
It is nationally. I believe Ohio, the fact finding's been fairly robust in Ohio. In terms of the number of negotiations and what percentage goes to fact finding.
Well, let me get to the ultimate question. Would you agree with me that there are arbitrators who are really, really good arbitrators? And if you've got a discipline case, a discharge case, they would be awesome. Will you agree with me that some of these people, if you use them for an interest arbitration, it's going to be a disaster?
Oh yeah, I mean, not everybody's well versed in these factors and how to get to a deal.
And so here's what I want to say to everybody out there watching. Look, you need an attorney, you need someone who knows what they're doing. If you're going to try to do this yourself, go and do it yourself. I don't care. But when it comes time to, selecting from that panel of arbitrators, you don't need a really, really good attorney. You need a really, really old person who knows all the people, and there's no way to learn that. You can't get this from a book. So it's worth investing 4 or 5 hours of time. Call Jonathan, call Mike. You want to try the case yourself with your city attorney, go for it. But if you try to list select without the input of one of these two guys or their ilk, you're running a heck of a risk. Okay, I want to get that off my chest.
I would like to interject here. They don't have to be old. They need to have experience. They need to know what they're doing. That doesn't mean they have to be old. Just saying. Just saying.
Hey, okay.
And there's also great resources on SERB's website. For those of you out there that might be put in this position sometime, there's all kinds of conciliation reports and fact-finding reports out there, and you can go in there and read some of them and get a good feel for some of the neutrals and how they are looking at and deciding on issues. And I think that's a great resource to use.
And Ms. Scott, I know in terms of, you did the update for the book Interest Arbitration. And I think we can all agree that that's the best book that's ever been written about interest arbitration, because I think it's the only book that's ever been written about interest arbitration. In reviewing thousands of conciliation and interest arbitration awards, did you see any that were incoherent?
Often, unfortunately, yes. If the arbitrator or the fact finder, whatever it is, doesn't follow the statutory language, doesn't look at all the factors that the arbitrator is required to look at, it's going to be incoherent because it makes no sense. It just makes no sense. Now, on the other hand, if there's a statute that doesn't give you any factors, then the arbitrator is going to have to be more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Resourceful.
That's a good word. Thank you, Jonathan. Because
The
bottom line is the arbitrator is charged with following the statutory criteria. That's why in that case that Dave and I were just talking about, where the ordinance clearly said it had to be, the comparators had to be of like cities, then if one party or the other is proposing that a county or private sector employer is the comparator, I have to disregard that. That's not what this ordinance said. I had to follow what the ordinance said.
Ms. Scott, in reviewing these thousands of arbitration awards, though, did you see hundreds of cases where the conciliator just simply ignored the statutory criteria?
I don't know about hundreds, but yes, I did see that. And it was to Jonathan's point. I found the union's proposal to be more persuasive. Why? You didn't say. So, that's the kind of thing that would drive me crazy if I were an advocate.
And I'm going to quote from one, and I can't remember what jurisdiction it came from. And it was one where statutorily you have to be comparing police officers to police officers. You can't be talking about internal equity. And the arbitrator said, you know, it was like written with a crayon on, you know, a yellow pad. Hey, it's just not fair to give a whopping increase to one group and not the other. And they didn't care about recruitment. They didn't care about retention. You know, it was what they could wrap their head around, even though it was a factor that, you know, specifically wasn't in the statute. The statute said like jurisdictions on the West Coast, you know, performing the same type of employment. So it's
Then you got F. I mean, if you look at the factors Jonathan put up, you have F, and you have past collective bargaining agreements, and you know, you have these other factors in Ohio, and so you can get a lot in. The question is, where do you put your emphasis? You know, in the past, the emphasis has been on B, and employers like to quote D a lot, the lawful authority of the public employer to budget. But F has always come into play. I mean, and so has it talks about private and public sector comparable work. My thing is those aren't comparables, but if you're comparing, you know, different types of jobs, but it is something that you could throw in F. And I think given what's going on in the economy, A, B, C, D, E, and F can one can be more important than the other at any other time.
Well, now I'm going to ask you two gentlemen, and you know, you can talk about this for hours. And I don't know who wants to go first. Hey, what do you think a comparable jurisdiction is?
Some of our initial discussions are, what do we believe are comparables? And typically both parties will just say, well, we think you're wrong and we're right, and not come down to a set of comparables. What I find is the more successful negotiations is where the parties do have an agreement on at least 90% of the comparable jurisdictions. And then it becomes the pattern for future negotiations. I'm working with one city right now that they've used the same comparables for 6 rounds of negotiations because the area around them has changed just about the same they have. So that's what is a comparable jurisdiction. It is negotiable, and it becomes one of the more difficult issues to negotiate, because if you have lawyers at the table, they want to be able to pick the ones that they want, and a good advocate on the other side will do the same.
And I think Jonathan's right. We've had more success where we agreed to what with the employer, right? It all depends on what I think it gets down to, are you trying to find the right answer, or are you looking for an advantage? And what I'm going to say now is I think what you're going to see going forward is more of a, let's try to find the right answer, because operations are dictating that, versus the gamesmanship that occurred when you had a labor market that had a bunch of baby boomers and a bunch of millennials in it, and you could replace people fairly easily. I think the change in the labor market is going to have to change the paradigm at the bargaining table, because if you don't get the right answer, you are not going to be able to recruit and retain people.
Well, Mike, let's get a little more granular. Do you think population is the most important factor in comparability?
Well, I would say population. I would also look at, what are the industries in that, what is the income that's coming in? Like Franklin County is probably the biggest and the most well-funded county in Ohio, right?
And I'm gonna cut you off. Kristen, do you care in your comparables about population?
We do. So we have determined a set of factors, and we actually present these when we're presenting to a neutral on how we've determined our comparables. I wouldn't say we specifically weight one over the other, but we do, let's talk about other states compared to Ohio for a second. We look at, geographic proximity to Ohio. We do look at whether or not they have collective bargaining. We look at population. We look at cost of living in those states as well. So and there's some other factors too, but those are just, we kind of make a chart and say, okay, where do some of these states fall within these things and determine which ones can we successfully argue are the most similar to Ohio?
And we always come up with Michigan.
The whole damn state.
We're forever linked with that state up north.
Straight up north.
Yeah,
So Dave and Shianne, Dave, you guys know, the Ohio collective bargaining law was the last comprehensive law passed in the United States for a major state, for an industrial state. And as a result, we had the track record starting with the 54 Act in Wisconsin, the 64 Taylor Act in New York, et cetera, to come up with this series of factors. So what you're seeing on your screen right there, it was what was negotiated during the debate on Senate Bill 133 in 1983, including the last piece, which gets to what Mike's point is. For public employers, I'm going to caution you, look, it says procedures in public service or private employment. It looks at the comps to the private employment as well, up there in item C, issues related to public and private employees. Years ago, one of the key arbitrators in the state, lectured me on, we need to only look at the geographic area, not the population. So some folks look at the population in the entire state of Ohio. And you remember Mike Harry said, no, I'm going to look at the geographic labor market. Well, that's now out the window because people are much more mobile. So I'm going to have to look to who's being recruited, where the turnover, and other things. So we're looking at more robust and granular information, as Kristen's indicated, because the geographic area may be the one, but population without other factors included in it, Dave, because of the vast variety of taxing sources and taxing abilities of the jurisdictions in Ohio, give you a pause to think about, how do they raise money, which gets me back into other factors that are listed there for us to look at. So it becomes very complex at times in terms of what's comparable. It becomes very complex based on the factors of the change in the economy, the single labor market, the available resources, the demographics, and where are you financially at this point in time?
And
Uh-oh.
Ohio's done a really good job, I would say, that in terms of, their finances, they manage their finances well, as the state has managed their finances well. And back in, I want to say, in 2001, that wasn't the case. I mean, when in 2001 through, I would say 2011, the employer had a great advantage in the economics because they weren't robust. There wasn't robust wages. There wasn't money to be had, and I think things have changed a little bit in Ohio. The economy is better. It's more diverse. It's not impacted by the recessions as much as it was. Because it is more diverse. It's not wholly dependent on manufacturing. But if you go to some of these, jurisdictions, like I grew up in Steubenville, Ohio, I'm sure that their finances are not in good shape because it was totally dependent on those steel mills. But if you're in Franklin County and you got Ohio State and Nationwide and all these insurance companies that are downtown and big employers like Cardinal Health, your finances are pretty good. So it depends on the jurisdiction again, and so while comparables are helpful, I think you still have to look at each individual jurisdiction and what's going on in their economy.
Okay, and we've got 5 minutes left, so I want to talk a little bit about resources. So I'm going to assume everybody out there's got a copy of How Arbitration Works by Ilkuri and Ilkuri, and that they've probably read it cover to cover a couple of times. And you know, Jonathan, my recollection is, how long is Ilkuri? About 500 pages?
I think that's the intro, but absolutely, and thousands of well-researched footnotes.
How many pages in that book discuss interest arbitration? Or
Oh, God, I don't know, because
Probably
Maybe-
one chapter, maybe less than a chapter.
but it doesn't. But the unfortunate, Corey does not go into how you do interest arbitration. It just talks about results of interest arbitration. So it really doesn't give you, in my opinion, that any guidance. The only other place I've seen it written was in James Budd book on labor and relations, and he's out of Minnesota. It's the course book that I use up at OSU when I teach the labor class up there. So there really aren't any sources out there, and I'll put a plug in for it. The book's in the 3rd edition right now, guys, and if you'll go forward, if you would, Chris, to slide 18. We don't get this book is done more as a public service than it is to make money. One more slide. And if you look at the names at the bottom, those are all practicing arbitrators or support staff folks, and including one person who was Stephen Hayford, who was a Stephen's not on that list. Stephen Hayford's on the list in the book. He was my professor in undergraduate at the Virginia Tech. So you have coast to coast experience in this. And for the people attending, I'll just say the agenda for today was pieces of the table of contents from here. And you can go look at where you want to find arbitration decisions, but the briefs that are submitted, the charts that are provided to the arbitrators in interest arbitration are not at CERB. So where do you go to find examples of that? You call your colleagues, or you use ones you used before, but this is something that I've worked with from the very beginning. I had the good fortune to have an economics in undergraduate. So, you know, spreadsheets and budgets were fun for me, but everybody else kind of grind their teeth at it. So I'm not trying to shamelessly plug a book, except to tell you that the group of people here have a national experience and national exposure. You know, Dave, Will, and I are, you know, we're a little island. Shianne comes to it with civil service experience and background to it as well. The whole goal of this session was to, you know, broaden the knowledge of people. So bottom line, David, my point is this: I use the negotiations process and the impasse process to educate both sides of the table, so that next time we come back to the table, we get a resolution at the table and not at the impasse process.
yeah, and this is, I just want to put a little fear into people. It's a scary process, because I mean, there's millions and millions of dollars at stake, and more important than that, you know, think about court overtime. The last time I dealt with court overtime, you know, the police department had a manual on how officers are assigned to court. And that manual went about 40 pages. And, you know, there's, you know, in LA County, you've got 180 some different political subdivisions. And an arbitrator can really screw that up. You know, you think about the danger of going to conciliation. And it's especially dangerous if you don't have someone like Mike or Jonathan, and they could be the best attorney in the world, but if they don't understand the mechanics of firefighter scheduling, if they don't understand the mechanics of, you know, cop shifts, and you know, the 9 hours, the 10 hours, the 11-hour, the 12-hour shifts, things are going to end badly. So I want to give everyone one last chance to say what they didn't say before. So Kristen, is there anything you think you missed?
No, I mean, I would echo what you said, Dave. I think really, preparation, understanding what you are dealing with going in and being able to present the data in a way to educate the neutral is really the key if you find yourself being an advocate in the interest arbitration forum.
Mike, any final thoughts?
I would like to take the opportunity to lobby the employer representatives out there to look at the paradigm that's been used and challenge that, because the future is not what the past has been. We have a changed labor market. We do have a scarcity of labor. We have to approach this together to figure out how these jurisdictions can provide the services that the public needs.
Arbitrator Scott, any final thoughts?
What Kristen said. That is be prepared to educate the neutral, be prepared from the beginning before you even go to the bargaining table to be presenting your case at interest arbitration and hope for the best, but be prepared for the worst, if you know what I mean. Be prepared for everything and put on a good case.
I'll jump on top of that too. Know who your arbitrator is, read their prior awards. Ms. Scott, she used to do City of Portland, big metropolitan city. She used to run their entire civil service. So she understands how cops and firefighters work, how a 911 call center works. You can get arbitrators who are fantastic arbitrators who have spent their entire career in, the private sector, where, they were working for US Steel or Union Pacific. And they don't understand PERS. They don't understand retirement systems. They don't understand the nuts and bolts of things that they could accidentally screw up. And of course, Jonathan, you get to go last. Anything you missed?
No, it's a challenge, but everything we've talked about today has been in labor history somewhere. And one needs to understand history to understand how to go forward. I really appreciated you started off with the 1919 strike, but labor relations goes back several hundreds of years. And if you understand the history, you understand how to get to agreements so you can avoid the impasse. And it has to do with education and listening across the board. But
Now,
thank you, everybody, and for this, and Dave and Shianne, especially to the two of you for getting up early and appearing on camera in Ohio. Very much appreciate it.
thanks for having us.
Yes, on behalf of Colera, I want to thank you as well. I think this was a lively discussion on whether you want to call it fact-finding, conciliation, or interest arbitration. I think you brought forth a wealth of information. I'm reading the comments. Everybody agrees that this has been an excellent program. So thank everyone. Next week, we have a session on unfair labor practices, and the presenters will be from SERB. So I asked you all to join us back. Same link, same time. Different date though, next Friday. See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Meta, do you want us to stay on with you for a minute?
Yes.
All right.
And Jonathan, I'm asking you to stay on because we were negotiating this book deal. So what's going to happen is I'm going to poll to see who's interested in the book, because I know I have a price break if I get 20 people. Another
Okay,
price
good.
break.
How much is the book?
I think it was $49.99, but they were going to give it to me for $29.99. But with the price break at 20, it's going to be additional money off. So that's what I have to look into. I was away last week, so just coming back late. So I just have to follow through with that.
Mike, for you, $149.99.
I just wanted to get insight into your mind.
I can tell you that I'm not going to be taking any vacations on the royalties on this.
But Dave and Shianne, thank you again for, I know you get in the wee hours of the morning to do this.
Hey, Mike, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Is the book share it with your colleagues in other states.
I will, I can probably send it to the, some of the union people that I.
They need it bad. I mean,
Well, look, I only negotiated the state contract, and since I've come to OCSC, I've been doing some of these smaller jurisdictions that Jonathan's been dealing with for years. And yes, even when I went to the city of Columbus, I was amazed at how
sophisticated.
knowledge about this whole process, and people didn't understand that people do use their bat and determine whether or not, hey, if you're not going to give it to me, I might as well go here, right?
All I know is throughout the Midwest, I mean, Shianne and I see cases where they schedule, an interest arbitration for 4 hours. And, we walk in there and we know it's going to be a joke. And we can't.
Ours was what, 4 days, Kristen? 5 days in 2015 or whatever it was.
Oh yeah, our fact finding, yeah, 4 or 5
Yeah.
days. And then we did, when we did the troopers, we did 2 days hearing for conciliation on only 3 issues.
Yeah, I mean, if you depends on how many issues you take, and I know these fact finders don't want to deal with 35 issues, and it's really the advocate's responsibility to try to narrow the field. Unfortunately, I think, I do think it gets back to this whole paradigm. Are you looking for advantage, or are you looking to find the sweet spot that everybody can live with, and that's going to get you the results that you want?
So Dave, to pick on you and Shianne, what's the National Academy doing to include in your conferences pieces about how to read a budget?
Nothing. So I'm on the planning committee for the next National Academy meeting. And I mean, God, man, no one's recording this, are they?
Oh, let me stop. Hold on.
I mean,